Now today I'd like for us to talk about the stars. If you go outside at night and look up, you'll see stars. And astronomers tell us the stars are just like our sun, only they're way, way much farther away than our sun. But the Bible has some interesting things to say about stars, and that's what I'd like for us to talk about today. Now, we heard for our Old Testament reading what's called the Song of Deborah, and I wanted to talk about that for a minute. In the first part of the book of Judges, we heard from Judges 5. In the first part of the book of Judges, we see the death of a man named Joshua. And Joshua, remember, was the man who led the Hebrews into the promised land after the death of Moses. Now remember, the Hebrews left slavery in Egypt. They wandered in the desert 40 years. After the death of Moses, they entered into the promised land under Joshua. Now, the book of Judges tells us that the Hebrew people were faithful to God as long as Joshua was alive. And then it says that even after Joshua died, they were faithful, as long as there were some people still alive that could remember all the things that God had done for them as they were entering the promised land. But of course, gradually all those eyewitnesses to those things died out. And after that happened, the Hebrew people started turning their backs on God. And they started worshiping other gods. So the book of Judges goes on to tell us how they began worshiping other gods. And over, as punishment for that, God let them be conquered by other people. But then God would relent. God would feel sorry for them, and he would drive out the conquerors. They were conquered by the king of Mesopotamia for 8 years. God delivered them. They turned from God again. They were conquered by the king of Moab. That lasted for 18 years. God delivered them from that, and they turned their backs on God again. And they were conquered by the king of Canaan, and the Canaanites ruled them for 20 years. And God delivered them from the Canaanites by a man named Barak. And it's interesting how that happened. There was a woman named Deborah, and Deborah was a prophet. And she went to Barak one day and she said, "You should raise an army and go fight against the Canaanites because God will give you victory." And Barak said, "I'm only going to do that if you'll go also." So Deborah agreed to go. And so Barak goes out among the Hebrew people, and some of them say, "Yeah, we'll go help you fight," and others say, "No, we're not having anything to do with this." But he finally raises an army of about 10,000 men, and he takes that army, and he and the men and Deborah all go up to Mount Tabor. Now, as all this is going on, word has reached the Canaanites that Barak is raising an army to fight them. So the Canaanite army, under the command of a man named Sisera, gathers at the river Kishon, and we're not told how many men Sisera had, but we are told he had 900 iron chariots and a huge army. So there, Deborah and Barak and the 10,000 Hebrews are up here on Mount Tabor, and they see all this happening down there. And Deborah tells Barak, "Take your army and go down there and fight the Canaanite army, and God will give you victory." And so Barak takes his army down there, and he is victorious. The Canaanite army is routed, and they start fleeing. Barak and his men chase them down and kill them. But their commander, Sisera, escapes, and he runs off. Now, he's running along, and he comes up to a tent, and this is in the land of a man named Heber. And Heber is descended from the father-in-law of Moses. And his family is at peace with the Canaanites, and they're not involved in this battle. And Sisera comes into that land, and he runs upon a tent. It's a woman named Jael. And Jael is Heber's wife. And Sisera thinks, well, since Heber and his family are at peace with the Canaanites, I'll be safe here. So he goes up to Jael's tent and he says, will you hide me? And she said, yeah, I'll hide you. She brings him into the tent, hides him under a blanket. And remember, Sisera's just gone through this long battle and this escape from the battle, and he's thirsty and exhausted, so he asks for some water. She brings him some milk, and he drinks it. And then he lays back down. He's going to sleep for a while, and he tells her to stand at the door of the tent, and if anybody comes asking if there's a man there, tell them no. And she says she'll do that. So he lays down and hides himself under that blanket, and he goes to sleep. Well, when he goes to sleep, Jael comes over there, picks up a tent peg, and drives it through the side of his head and kills him. It's not long then before Barak shows up, and he's looking for Sisera. He comes up and he says, is there a man here? And Jael says, yeah, he's over here. She brings Barak in and shows him the body of Sisera laying there with the tent peg still driven through his head. And then we're told that Barak goes out and gets his army, and this sort of invigorates them, and they completely destroy the forces of the king of Canaan. And then God has delivered them from the Canaanites, and they have 40 years of peace. Now, after all this happens, Deborah and Barak get together and they sing a song praising God for what God did. And we heard that as our Old Testament reading. But one part of it I especially thought was interesting. The kings came and fought. The kings of Canaan fought in Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They took no spoils of silver. They fought from the heavens. The stars from their courses fought against Sisera. Now, the interesting thing there is how it says they fought from the heavens. The stars from their courses fought against Sisera. The stars fought against Sisera. Now, when we read the Bible, we come to the Bible with ideas already in our minds. We've talked about that before. When we read anything from the Bible, we have in our minds already what we've heard about the Bible, what other people have told us about the Bible, what we've always been taught about the Bible. And when we read something from the Bible, we filter what we read through all that stuff we've already heard and we've always been taught. Now, that also goes for things that are not religious. And so when we read this in the Bible about the stars fighting from their courses against Sisera, we have in our mind what stars are. Like we said, stars are just like our sun, only they're way, way, way far off. But that's what stars are. And so when we hear this in Judges about the stars fighting against Sisera, we immediately assume it must be poetic. It must be something like from a poem. After all, stars can't fight against someone. So it can't be taken literally. It's just a poetic statement. But remember, the people who wrote the Bible didn't think of things like we do. Could it be that when they said the stars in their courses fought against Sisera, it wasn't poetic license at all? It was that they really meant it. I want us to look at another passage. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, Moses is speaking to the people, and he is admonishing them to stay true to God and follow God's commandments. And he says this, "Take heed, lest you lift your eyes to heaven. When you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven, you feel driven to worship them and serve them." Now, the host of heaven is literally the armies of heaven or the powers of heaven. And we've talked in here before how in the Bible the word heaven does double duty. Sometimes when you see the word heaven in the Bible, it's talking about heaven as we normally think about heaven. Other times when you see the word heaven in the Bible, it's talking about what's up in the sky. And you sort of have to go on context to determine which one it is. And since this verse talks about looking up and looking at the sun, moon, and stars, we would have to say that it's talking about heaven in that sense of what's up in the sky. And so host of heavens then, we would have to mean the powers up in the sky. So you think, what are the powers up in the sky? And again, remember, when we read the Bible, we filter it through our preconceived notions. We hear it in relation to ideas that are already in our minds. So when we hear this about Moses telling the people not to worship the sun and moon and stars or any of the powers up in the heavens, we would think, well, he's telling them not to worship these things, and that's right, that's what he's telling. But we'd also go along with, and we'd say, well, Moses is also telling us that those things can't do anything. There's no use worshiping the sun or the moon or the stars because they're powerless. They can't do anything. It'd be like you worshiping a rock. Why would you worship a rock when all it can do is lay there on the ground? And so we'd filter that passage and we'd come up with the idea that Moses just saying, you people don't worship stuff like that. They're powerless. They can't do anything. The problem with that is there's a phrase in there that says, the powers up in the sky. The powers. That certainly doesn't seem like Moses is saying don't worship this stuff because it has no power and can't do anything. If he thought that, why would he call it the powers up in the sky? Since it's called the powers up in the sky, they were obviously seen as having power. So is it possible that Moses thought that the things up in the sky really did have powers? Now I want us to look at another passage. This is later in the Old Testament. This is in the book of 2 Kings. We see a man named Josiah, who is the king of Judah. And remember how after the death of Solomon, the kingdom split into two parts, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Both Israel and Judah had a succession of bad kings after that, and things didn't go well for them, and the people turned away from God. But Josiah was seen as a good king. He tried to take things back to the way they should be, and he tried to restore devotion to God. And it says that Josiah found in what's called the house of the Lord what is called the book of the covenant. Now the house of the Lord is assumed to be the temple, and the book of the covenant is assumed to be the laws that God had given Moses back earlier in the book of Exodus. So apparently this book was found in the temple. Apparently it hadn't been used in a long time. Josiah had this book brought out, and he read it aloud to the priests and to all the people, and he said, I'm going to start following what it says here. And the people promised to do that also. And then it goes on to say that the Judeans had been worshiping other gods in the temple. It said that Josiah commanded the priests to bring out of the temple all the articles that were used for the worship of Baal, Asherah, and for all the host of heaven. And he had all that stuff burned. Now see, we see that host of heaven again. Literally the powers that are up in the sky. And apparently the Jews were worshiping the powers in the sky from the temple. And then this passage goes on to say that Josiah removed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense on the high places, and those who burned incense to Baal, who burned incense to the sun, to the moon, to the constellations, and to all the host of heaven. Interesting, we see host of heaven again. And it's also interesting, we see the word constellations. That is a translation, but literally it is the zodiac. Now, the zodiac is the path across which the sun moves from east to west. You know, in the wintertime, the sun is very low on the horizon as it moves along. In the summertime, it's higher. And that band that the sun moves across the sky from east to west is called the zodiac. And so there's a path there across the sky. The signs of the zodiac are the star constellations that you can see inside that band at different times of the year. In our day, most people talk about 12 signs of the zodiac. That means 12 star constellations visible in that band. In ancient times, they had more. In ancient Egypt, they had identified 36 constellations of stars in the zodiac. It wasn't until about the year 500 BC in Babylon that we first began to see the zodiac as consisting of 12 constellations in the sky, or 12 signs. Now, these star constellations visible in the zodiac were thought to exert power on earth. They were thought to influence things on earth. So this reference in 2 Kings is referring to the powers in the sky, and it is referring to the powers of the star constellations in the zodiac. And so the Jews were apparently worshiping the powers in the sky and the powers of the constellations of the zodiac. And Josiah determined to put a stop to it. Now again, we read the Bible and filter it through what we've already heard and what we already believe, not only about religion, but about everything else too. And when we read that, we naturally assume that these powers they were worshiping did not have any power at all, because we have a scientific view of the universe. And we also assume that Josiah knew that they didn't have any power at all. But let's not be too certain. It's entirely possible that Moses and Deborah and Josiah and Barak really thought that there were powers up in the sky influencing things on earth. They thought that they were really powers, really some kind of spiritual powers. It's just that what they were saying is, these things are real, just don't worship them, because they're not God. These things are real, but they're not God. As I said, though, with our modern minds, we reject the idea that there are powers in the sky. In the New Testament, if we go to the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, it talks about spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. There we see that word host again. It means armies or powers, forces, spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. And when we see that heavenly places, we're thinking about, now why would there be forces of wickedness in heaven? But really, you got to remember the word heaven in the Bible does double duty for heaven as we think of it, or up in the sky. So sometimes it refers to heaven, sometimes it refers to up in the sky. In this case, it refers to what's in the sky. And so what this is talking about is wicked spiritual powers up in the sky in the book of Ephesians. For our gospel reading, we heard Jesus talking about the end times, the time of the end of the world. And we heard him say, the stars of heaven will fall. The powers in the heavens will be shaken. And he's talking about things up in the sky. The stars and the powers that are up in the sky. From the book of Revelation, we hear the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its late figs when shaken by a wind. Also from the book of Revelation we hear, I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth. To him was given the key to the shaft of the abyss. And he opened the shaft of the abyss, and smoke arose out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. You see, this star came down from heaven with a key and opened the shaft of the abyss. So this star was not just something twinkling up in the sky. It was some kind of entity, a living entity that could do something. And when that star came down and opened the shaft of the abyss, locusts swarmed out, and they tormented the people for months and months that did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Now, granted, Revelation is written in terms that we don't necessarily have to see this as a photograph of something actually happening, but the point is that the star was seen as some kind of living entity with power and the ability to do something. We also hear in Revelation, then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was bitter. Now, wormwood is an herb, and it's commonly grown as an ornamental plant, and it's moderately poisonous when ingested in large amounts. But oddly enough, in small amounts, sometimes it's used as flavorings. It is used in liquors and wines, and it has been used in small quantities as a spice. If you've ever heard the term bitters when at a bar or a bartender, that's what that is. Sometimes it's used for medicinal purposes. It's a remedy for indigestion if you give it in small amounts. But in this case, in Revelation, it's not in small amounts. It's contaminating a third of the water on earth, and many people die. And all of this is done by a star, a living entity that has power. Again, we remember that Revelation is written in different terms, and we don't necessarily want to see that as a photograph, but it is clear that stars were seen as having powers to do something. Now, when ancient people looked up into the sky, of course, they looked at it from this vantage point. They never had the opportunity the way since 1969 we have had the opportunity to see the earth from outer space. And they looked up in the sky, and they saw these little dots sitting there. And they wondered what they were. They didn't really know what they were. They wondered what they were. Now today, with scientific knowledge, of course, we think we know what they are. And so we have a completely different way of looking at stars than they did. We might be tempted to dismiss the way they looked at stars, sort of looking at it as people that, they really didn't know what was up there. They thought the sun and moon moved. They didn't realize the earth was moving. They certainly didn't realize the earth was spinning. So we could look at it as just superstition and folklore of pre-scientific people who really didn't understand the way the world works. And we could say, I sort of feel sorry for them. They didn't understand anything, so we'll make allowances for them. But now we understand everything, so, we know it all, today. But maybe we could stop for a minute and think. Maybe what these ancient people were telling us about powers up in the sky, real living spiritual entities that do things on earth and influence things on earth, maybe that's not as far out as we think. Maybe with all our sophistication today, and we think we know everything today, maybe about some things those people actually knew more than we do.